Okay, it is the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get started just to be respectful of folks' time, and because we've got quite a bit of content, we might be a little overambitious on the number of slides we've got for the hour. And start off with introductions. I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the Minnesota State Floodplain Manager, and Garry Bennett, who's also got his camera on, is a floodplain hydrologist working with me at statewide, and we will be co-presenting. And I'll point out that Garry did all the work on getting these slides ready, which was wonderful. I appreciate that, Garry. And we'll be going back and forth on presenting. I think enough of you have been at these virtual trainings. You kind of know how it works, but we will be providing PDF copies of the slides afterwards. We'll send them out in the next couple days. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. We do have a lot of content, so we'll probably only take questions from the chat while we're giving the main presentation. At the end, we may have some time for open questions, and we'll definitely stick around for any questions at the end, but that might spill into past 2 o'clock. So if you have questions that we aren't able to answer during this time and that we need to research, we'll be following up with you. So this is talking about the new FEMA elevation certificate, and we'll talk about the background on elevation certificates and what the purpose is, who should be using them, who's required to use them, that kind of stuff. Some of the main things that got updated in the recent new elevation certificate, review of some key terms, and a little bit about flood insurance and how that fits in with the new elevation certificate. And the bulk of the training will be going through the different sections of the elevation certificate. So the background, the who, what, where, purpose of the elevation certificate is to record information used to determine compliance in most cases. It also can be used for letters of map change if someone's requesting that of FEMA. And for communities that are in the community rating system, which there's 9 in Minnesota that are CRS communities, it's mandatory for them to use the FEMA elevation certificate as at least one of the ways that they document the work that was done for a particular new structure. It used to be that if you had a building in a FEMA mapped zone and were getting flood insurance, you had to submit an elevation certificate, and that was part of how they figured out the premium for that property. It's no longer mandatory for getting the flood insurance rates figured out when you're in an A zone, a high risk zone, but we're finding it usually helps to get a better rate if you use the elevation certificate. And I'll just note that these green things that are in green are some of the changes that are on the elevation certificate or in the way it's being used. And so again, it's no longer required to have the elevation certificate to get a premium calculated if you're in the high risk zone, but it's recommended. We'll talk about that a couple times here. Also, you can use the elevation certificate in any zone. And since the way that the rating is being done does look at factors that involve elevations, it can be helpful for those properties that are not in the high risk areas also. And you can get the updated edition at the FEMA site in that underwriting section. It is a little tricky. You have to do a right click to download it in most cases. I can send a copy to folks if they have trouble getting that. And I know I've just done a printed version because some folks were having trouble with the fillable version if you want to just be able to see what that elevation certificate looks like. Touched on some of this, that it is encouraged for documenting the as-built elevation especially for those lowest floors, and making sure it's above the regulatory flood protection elevation, and for letters of map changes. The elevation certificate can be used to show that lowest adjacent grade, and that base, it can be used to document the base flood elevation that was used. And as I mentioned, it's required for community rating system communities, and that in general, it has to be completed and signed by a professional land surveyor or a qualified professional engineer who's qualified in that area. As we'll talk later, there's a few places where anyone can fill out portions of the new elevation certificate. And there is a part for community officials that we'll get into in a little bit more detail. The insurance agents can use them when they're rating a policy, if it will give better rates. Some of the main changes from the previous form were improving the way it aligns with the rating steps for doing the rating for the flood insurance policies. And there were a lot of updates, a lot of changes in the wording of the instructions, and even in the way that some of the things were shown on the form. There was an ASFPM, an Association of State Floodplain Managers group, that evaluated the old form in a lot of detail and provided detailed comments to FEMA. And to FEMA's credit, they pretty much incorporated most of those comments that the ASFPM groups provided. So a lot of cleanup, a lot of effort went into updating this current elevation certificate. One of the things we'll mention is that it now better deals with flood openings when there's both engineered and non-engineered openings. And it's got updated things like having phone numbers and emails, and the instructions have updated web addresses. The reminder that you are required to start using this new form on November 1st. Originally rolled out, they were expecting to have it be used starting on July 7th, but there were some issues with not being able to put not applicable, and it was making it so you couldn't put the right number of significant digits in base flood elevations and some other things like that. So they did delay it while they were getting some of those problems fixed. And a reminder that elevation certificates that were completed previously, they're still good as long as they were signed and sealed before November 1st, 2023. If they use the elevation certificate form that was the correct one at the time it was done, those don't expire. As long as that building continues to be the same building, they haven't added on, they haven't made changes to that building, then that's still a valid elevation certificate going into the future. Few terms, I know based on who I'm seeing that's attending today, you guys probably know these things, but a quick reminder, FIRM is the flood insurance rate map. That's the main map of the FEMA mapped high risk areas. Flood insurance study is the study that goes with those maps. It's got details on the base flood elevations and stage increases and sources of data and all kinds of useful information. The base flood elevation is also known as the 100-year elevation or the 1% annual chance flood elevation, but base flood elevation is basically what FEMA uses in these documents and much of their requirements. Lowest adjacent grade, really important for the elevation, for the determining what the costs, what the premiums will be for flood insurance. And it is one of those requirements for meeting the minimum regulations, is that the lowest floor elevation and the lowest adjacent grade are at those minimum required elevations. Highest adjacent grade gets used is on the elevation certificate, gets used sometimes for some of the calculations, isn't used as frequently for regulations. We'll get into more about the bottom floor elevations versus the lowest floor and the first floor height. The first floor height's a new term in the FEMA risk rating 2.0 and the new way that FEMA's doing the rating of flood insurance policies. And we'll get into more details on those definitions and how they're used. And speaking of the flood insurance rating methodology, that has been updated, and we were a couple years into the new risk rating 2.0, and we no longer are looking at one of the key rating factors being whether they're in the high risk zone or not. That it doesn't matter if it's in the high risk zone or not. FEMA's looking at the same bundle of rating variables no matter where the property is. And they also don't use the base flood elevation as one of the variables anymore. We'll be talking a little bit more about some of those key elevations they do use, but those, the flood zone and the base flood elevation are no longer used. And as mentioned, they look at the relative elevations for all properties, whether they're in those zones or not. So they do look at, I get into a little bit more here on this page, but they do look at, in terms of elevations and where they are relative to the flood risk, they'll look at how far away they are from the flood risk, how high above the flood risk they are, the flooding source. And they also look at your relative height within 500 meters. So even if you're not by a FEMA mapped flood source, if you are in a depression, an area where you would get that localized flooding, the urban flooding or the fluvial flooding, as you're hearing that term used more often, they are looking at that. They continue to look at what kind of building occupancy is it? Is it a single family home? Is it a multi-family home? Is it non-residential? Those kinds of things. They do look at whether it's a framed or masonry or a combination. They look at that foundation type, and we've got some diagrams showing that. First floor height is going to be the first floor above the lowest adjacent grade. That lowest adjacent grade is the lowest place where the land, the ground touches that building. The replacement cost is a factor now, which does get at some of the equity. In the past, people were rated the same no matter the value of the building. And in reality, that meant that people with big, expensive buildings, they were getting a better deal because a foot of flooding on a foot of a bigger building meant more damage. And so that's now taken into consideration. They do also look at how many floors there are in the building, and for the condos and other buildings that have multiple levels like that, they consider what floor you're on. And data construction is important from the perspective of whether it was built before or after there were regulations and there were FEMA maps, particularly in those mapped areas. So here's the main foundation types we'll be looking at, and we'll talk about these a bit more as we get into the different sections. But they are doing some clumping for insurance purposes of these foundation types that are in the elevation certificate. In the instructions part of the elevation certificate, you have all these different building diagrams for the elevation certificate. For the insurance purposes, they clump slab on grade and one of the split level types together. They've got the basement type buildings together. They've got these that are elevated without an enclosure, without anything enclosed below that elevated part is in diagram 5. And then those that are elevated, the main living portions are elevated, but they might have an enclosed area for parking. That's treated differently. And then we've got those that are elevated with perimeter walls. And if they're meeting the floodplain regs, they've got flood openings. As we'll mention, whether or not they've got flood openings will be indicated in the elevation certificate. But from a regulatory standpoint, for them to be client, they should have those flood openings. And the main difference that we get into here is If it is 5 feet or less for that elevated portion, that's considered a crawl space. If it's over the 5 feet, it's the diagram 7. And there are discounts for the flood insurance rating that they get if they have proper flood openings, and they only get the discount if they've got the proper number of openings and they're the proper size. And we'll be seeing that they get into a lot more detail now on the elevation certificate about documenting what kinds of flood vents are there. And we'll get into that in a few more slides. The other discount that comes up is there's a 5% discount if you've elevated all of your machinery and equipment. Then you get that discount, but it has to be elevated 1 floor above the floor that's above grade. So if it's a single family, or if it's a slab on grade that's 1 level, you actually have to elevate it to the attic. So that one's not too realistic, but for some of the other building types, that can be an incentive to get that machinery and equipment elevated and safer from flooding. So we'll be talking about some of those things. Floodplain managers still need to know the flood zone and know the base flood elevation, and that is covered. Some of that information is in section B of the form, but again, they don't use that as a direct rating variable. That might influence some of those other variables that FEMA looks at for insurance, but it's not entered directly as it used to be. The first floor height, usually we're going to want that surveyed first floor height, or they'll use some behind the scene a rating engine to figure that out. It is possible to show that first floor height in another new section of the elevation certificate in section H and have someone actually measure it, but it's still best if it's in the surveyed section in section C. So we will talk though about section H and how that can be used for insurance rating without a survey. So overall, there were updates in pretty much every section. Property information was expanded. There's some additional information and reformatting in section B, a lot of clarifications in some of these other areas, and then the brand new sections are section H and I, where the owner or their rep can do some measuring and certify that on the form. And we're going to switch to Garry talking.
Yeah, thanks. So we're going to, Ceil and I are going to go through each section of the elevation certificate, and we've got a lot of material to cover. So let's dive in. I'm going to start with section A, property information. This is a section of the elevation certificate where you're going to enter information that's pertinent to the building itself. So section A is required for all purposes. That includes floodplain management, insurance, and letter of map changes. However, it can be completed by the community or the homeowner. So basically by anybody. For property description, here's where you're going to enter the parcel ID number or the legal description. For building use, you want to be as specific as possible. Is it a residential structure? Is it non-residential? Are you adding a shed or a garage? Are you adding an addition? If you're adding an addition, you should make note of what that addition is in the comment section of section D. You're going to enter the latitude and longitude as well as the horizontal datum. And what we want to note here is that new to elevation certificate is you can now use WGS 84 horizontal datum. And coincidentally, that is the same horizontal datum that's used by Google Earth. So if you're a Google Earth user, you can now use that for your lat longs. Also make note, if you're a surveyor or a community and the horizontal datum that you're using isn't one of those listed on the elevation certificate, be aware there are a number of datum conversion tools that are available to you online. New to elevation certificate, you are now required to submit color photographs. Minimum of 2, but in most cases, you're going to be submitting 4 color photographs. That's one for each side of the building. You're also going to be entering your building diagram number. Ceil kind of touched on those building diagrams. There are 11 of them in total. You can view those in the instructions for the elevation certificate. And we're going to talk more about building diagrams in some of the later slides. This is also the section where you're going to enter measurements for crawl spaces, enclosures, attached garages, and flood openings. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about those on the next slides. So when you're choosing your building diagram, You're basically going to compare the features of the building that's being certified with one of the features shown in the diagrams and select the diagram that's most applicable. We do want to point out the difference between diagram 7 and 8, and I think Ceil already touched on this. When you look at diagram 8, you got C2A, which is the top of the crawl space floor, and C2B is the top of the next higher floor. So basically the height of that crawl space. If the height of that crawl space is more than 5 feet, like Ceil had mentioned, you're going to use diagram 7. We're not going to consider it a crawl space. It will be considered an enclosure. Those are those spaces used for parking, access, and storage. If the height of the crawl space is more than 5 feet, yeah, you will be using diagram 8. A little more on the clarification between what is a crawl space and an enclosure. The photograph on the left shows an above grade crawl space. You can see that from the top of the crawl space floor to the top of the next higher floor, it's less than 5 feet. So that's going to be a diagram 8. It's only possible to be a diagram 9 if that were a below grade crawl space. If it had a basement, it would actually be diagram 2A or 2B. Now the photograph on the right shows a house that has an enclosure. You can see it's elevated on posts or pilings. It's got habitable space on that next higher floor. This is an enclosure that's used for parking, access, or storage. So this would be diagram 6. When completing the elevation certificate for A9, this is dealing with buildings that have an attached garage. You need to be aware of how the elevation certificate defines what is an attached garage and what is not an attached garage. So on the left, an attached garage are those that have a common wall, single structure. There's nothing above the garage. So that one is an attached garage. Now on the right, what is not an attached garage is where you've got those tuck under garages. You've got parking on the bottom floor. It is an enclosure that's underneath an elevated building. So that would be an enclosure. In this particular case, again, it's used for parking, access, or storage only. Kind of continuing our theme on enclosures and attached garages, the house on the left, you can see that's got the enclosure. We've already defined what that is. You're going to complete section A8 of the elevation certificate. Now the house on the right, that's an attached garage. You are going to use or complete section A9 of the elevation certificate. I'm not sure if it's worth pointing out, but when you are choosing your building diagram, please note that where you actually have an attached garage, that's not going to be shown on any of the building diagrams. Where you see a garage on the building diagrams, it's going to be when you've got an enclosure. Sections A8 and A9 of the elevation certificate, as Ceil already mentioned, they're going to ask a lot of information about flood openings. And those flood openings are those permanent openings that allow for the free passage of water automatically in both directions without human intervention. Both these sections expand on the information that they collect on flood openings. As you can see, all these sections are highlighted in green, so that's all new. There's a reminder that there must be a minimum of 2 openings, and it's got the question saying, are there at least one flood opening on 2 different sides of the building, as those are required for every enclosed area or crawl space. Lastly, it's going to ask you to enter the number and type of flood openings. And we get into flood openings in quite a bit more detail in the following slides. So go ahead and advance. Just a reminder that flood openings can be no more than 1 foot above grade. The illustration on the left shows a typical flood opening for a crawl space. And the middle two, I guess the middle and the right diagrams are really just showing those typical flood openings for those enclosures, those areas that are used for parking, access, or storage. This slide just shows some of the typical flood vents that you're going to see out there. The elevation certificate requires you to measure the amount of opening. So typically you get your caliper out and you're actually going to start measuring all those open spaces on your vents because you want to get the total amount of opening. Now, rather than doing that by hand, I do want to point out below that we've got the non-engineered opening guide, and that's where someone has actually pre-calculated the open space for these various types and configurations of flood vents. So you can simply do a Google search for non-engineered opening guide, and you should be able to find that pretty easily. And so I do recommend using that if you can, instead of manually measuring the actual amount of space on those vents. Sections A8 and A9, so part C, again, this is where it's asked, what type of opening are you using and how many? So when they talk about the type of flood opening, they're talking about non-engineered flood openings versus engineered flood openings. And those non-engineered flood openings are those that have no moving parts. Whereas the engineered flood openings, they are triggered by flood conditions, and they do have movable parts that allow for flood water and debris to freely and automatically enter and exit. Now, FEMA, for the non-engineered flood openings, they do have a rather conservative ratio that's required for compliance. That is the 1 square inch of flood opening for every 1 square foot of enclosure. Now, those engineered flood openings, they are designed by an engineer. Those calculations have predetermined, the rating for that flood vent is predetermined. And oftentimes you can actually have a smaller vent than what you otherwise would have for a non-engineered flood opening. And again, that's because that 1-to-1 ratio is fairly conservative that FEMA has selected. You can see down in the box below for section A9, that's where you're going to enter the square footage of the attached garage, or if you're filling out section A8, that's going to be for the enclosure. Keep in mind that's for the outside footprint, not the inside footprint when you're measuring square footage. It asks, is there at least that one permanent opening on 2 different sides of the attached garage? And yeah, down below for part C is where you enter, how many openings do you have for both engineered and non-engineered flood openings? Now, if you are using engineered flood openings, just a reminder that the certification must be attached to the elevation certificate. If the certification that comes with those engineered flood openings is not attached to the elevation certificate, you must treat those as though they were non-engineered flood openings. So that's pretty key if you've got those engineered flood openings. Continuing with section A8 or A9, parts D through F. Part D is where you're going to enter that net open area for non-engineered openings. Part E is where you're going to enter the rated area for engineered openings. And again, that rated area is what is listed on the certification that comes with those engineered openings. And new for the elevation certificate, I believe if you're using both kinds, engineered and non-engineered, you can add up the amount of space. So we'll just quickly go through this. In our example here below, we've got one non-engineered flood opening. They got their caliper out and they measured 140 square inches. Now, keep in mind, FEMA has a 1-to-1 ratio. So that's going to cover 140 square feet of enclosed area. We also have 4 engineered flood openings. And if you look at the rating down below, it says each flood vent is rated for 220 square feet of enclosed area. So since we've got 4 of those, that's the 880 square feet we see up above. So to get your total for subpart F, you just add those 2 numbers together, 140 and 880, you get the 1,020 square feet of enclosed area. So that's what we've got for that. Section A has updated instructions. Some of these we've already talked about, but for A5, please know that you must indicate the latitude and longitude method or source used in the comments section. We talked about A6, you must provide a minimum of 2 photographs, but in most cases, you're going to be submitting 4 color photographs. For section A8 and A9B, reminder there are at least 2 flood openings within 1 foot of the adjacent grade, and are they at least on 2 exterior walls for those enclosures? A8 and A9C, it's going to ask for the total number of openings. We talked about that, engineered versus non-engineered. And then we already went through the exercise for part D, E, and F. That's where you're going to measure each amount of open area for the non-engineered, the rating for the engineered, and then you add them up for part F. So I'm going to move on to section B, flood insurance rate map information. As the name implies, most of this can come right off of the firm itself. Anybody can complete section B. There are no major changes in the form as far as data that's collected, but FEMA does add a lot of detail and clarity that have been added to the instructions. So some examples on the actual layout of the elevation certificate, they've changed B1 through B9. So it's no longer that table grid on the top. It's now more of a line format. Section B1B now asks you to enter the community identification number. So that's something that's a little bit new. For section B8, if the house or the building is located in multiple flood zones, you must list all flood zones, not just the most restrictive. You have to enter all of them. Similarly, for B9, you're going to list all appropriate base flood elevations. And lastly, for B13, it's going to ask you, is the building seaward of the Limois? So we're going to talk about some of those in a little more detail on the next slides. So all sections have updated instructions. So for section B, be aware that if using information based on best available data, such as base level engineering or advisory flood hazard data, you must indicate that you're doing that in the comments area of section D. So I think as far as like base level engineering, for example, that would be if you're obtaining a base flood elevation using our Lake and Flood Elevation Online tool. For B7, this is where you enter the firm panel effective or revised date. You can get that right off of the firm panel. If you don't have a copy of those maps, you certainly can view those on FEMA's Map Service Center, or if you're a surveyor, you could talk with your local floodplain official. Keep in mind, if the area where the building is located was revised by a LOMR, do not enter the LOMR date for B7, but we do want you to enter that LOMR effective date and case number in the comments area of section D. B9, again, that's where you're going to enter your base flood elevation. If you're using the FIS to obtain your base flood elevations, you must enter that to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. I believe the only time you're going to enter a whole number are those relatively rare situations where you're going to get the BFE from the firm, but there is no base flood elevation information in the FIS. It's strictly coming off of the firm. The BFE entered in item B9 must be based on hydrologic and hydraulic analysis. So it can't be based on approximate methods like contour interpolation. It has to have H&H analysis associated with it. And this last part here, if you're in a zone A where BFEs are not obtained from another source, enter NA in item B9 and complete section E. Let me clarify that. In Minnesota, this is only going to be applicable in an AO zone. So you don't have a base flood elevation for an AO zone, but you've got the depth. So for B, if you're in an AO zone, you can enter NA and then complete section E. And for B10, you're going to indicate the source entered for the item in B9. So if you're using a source other than the FIS or the firm, you should make a comment in the, well, you should include the study name, the source, the agency, and the company that produced it in the comments section. And I would do that even for a community determined. So a community may do a study, and I would list the community's study name, date in the comments section. B12 is going to ask if you're in a coastal barrier resource system. I'm just going to quickly say, they're not available for viewing on the firm, but you may be able to view them on the National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. In Minnesota, I believe we've only got one coastal barrier resources system, and that is Minnesota Point, adjacent to the aerial lift bridge in Duluth. So unless I'm mistaken, that was the only one I could find.
That's the only one we have. Yeah.
Okay. And then lastly, for B13, the elevation certificate asks if you are located seaward of the limit of moderate wave action, or the LIMWA. If the LIMWA is not shown on the firm, check no. This is important because for St. Louis County, when those preliminary maps become effective, we will have coastal areas that will have a LIMWA in some instances located. So for St. Louis County, this will be relevant in the future.
And every place else in the state, you can say no.
Thank you. Next slide. And I think Ceil's going to take it.
I get to take over. Okay, so section C has been in the elevation certificate, and this is what you're going to be quite familiar with. Again, they've clarified some of the instructions and made a few minor tweaks, but for the most part, it's the same information that's been required in the past. It is required that a licensed professional complete this section. That's not one that anyone can fill out. One of the new things that is there is a datum conversion factor box. It asks if there's a data conversion, and if so, you need to describe that in the comments section in section D. And again, it can be completed for insurance purposes to determine that first floor elevation, but there's not actually something that is labeled as first floor elevation. They'll use the data in this section to figure out what would be the first floor height. For the top of the bottom floor, just a couple of additional things to keep in mind, that it's measured at the top of the bottom floor. It's on that walking surface, typically, is what they talk about, is the top of the bottom floor. If we've got buildings elevated on a crawl space, then that next elevation is going to be the top of that crawl space. And it doesn't matter for filling out this form whether it has permanent flood openings or not. Whether it's got the compliant flood openings will make a difference for whether it's compliant and meeting the local ordinance, and it will make a difference in the rating. But the surveyor filling out this section of the elevation certificate, they're not making the determination whether those flood openings are compliant or not. And so there may or may not actually be any flood openings there. Then for the other building diagrams, you will be selecting one of those, even if it's in a low risk zone. If it's in on the old maps, you'll see zones B and C. On the newer maps, you'll see zone X's. And a few of our counties have zone D. So you are still selecting which building diagram, which type of building it is, no matter what zone it's in. And that if they have to have more than 2 levels surveyed, they have places to put comments and clarify which floors you're entering as the C2A versus C2B. And in this example, your C2A, your bottom floor is here. The next higher floor is that level up, that's the main level. And the LHSM, the lowest horizontal structural member, that it used to say it was only in V zones, but we do have those houses being elevated on pilings and these other options like this in areas outside of V zones. And also there are coastal A zones now. So it's something that's not required to have that one filled in, but if it isn't a V zone, then it should be filled in, and it can be filled in those other zones. So a floor by any other name. We've got the bottom floor, the lowest floor, the first floor. The bottom floor elevation is what goes in the C2A in that section C. And that's what's measured by the surveyor, and it can be at, above, or below grade. That is the bottom floor. The lowest floor elevation is determined for regulatory purposes. So that's not measured by the surveyor. It's interpreted based on the information in that section. And that's what determines whether the structure is compliant with that local ordinance. And a reminder that in Minnesota, that lowest floor for any new buildings or additions or substantial improvements is going to be at or above the regulatory flood protection elevation, which adds our foot of freeboard and any stage increase to meet the state minimums. And local governments may have higher standards. They may have a 2-foot or 3-foot freeboard instead of just the 1 foot that's required statewide. But the first floor height, that's what we're looking at for rating the insurance premiums. And the first floor always has to be at or above grade. It cannot be below ground. The bottom floor elevation includes those levels that might be below ground, the crawl space or the basement. But the first floor height that's used for the insurance rating, they're only going to look at the levels that are above grade. And it's going to be using the information that is in this section C or in the section H that we'll be talking about. And as Garry mentioned, we don't call this an attached garage. This is an enclosure below those living spaces, below those main floors. This would be an attached garage. And it's just got the one wall separating. It's not under other living space. Then for the machinery in E, you should be putting an answer here. There should be an answer. The kind of machinery would be in the comments section. And while I'm thinking of it here, just a reminder that every one of these should have an answer. If it's not applicable, don't put a 0, because a 0 is a real elevation in parts of the country. If you're in Louisiana, that's a real elevation. So put NA if it's not applicable. But for the machinery and equipment, you do need to look at what that lowest elevation would be that you find here and comment in the section D. And just be aware that there are some differences in what must be elevated for the eligibility for the insurance purposes versus for floodplain management. And a good resource is FEMA's Protecting Building Utility Systems from Flood Damage. And you can Google that, or we can provide links to that if you don't have that document. And here, when we get down to F, G, H, they're looking for that lowest adjacent grade next to the building or the highest adjacent grade next to the building. Again, it's that lowest or highest point where the the ground is touching the building, and they've added clarification on indicating whether it's that finished grade or the natural grade for the lowest adjacent grade and the highest adjacent grade. They've had lowest adjacent grade at the support for any attached deck and stairs for quite a few years. So in this example here, you have an attached deck, you have to put that lowest adjacent grade. If there's not an attached deck or stairs, you put NA there. And for that, it has to be the finished grade. So again, they've updated some of the instructions here. This can support a LOMA, a letter map amendment, a letter map revision based on fill, or conditional versions of those, that you would use section C for support for a LOMA F application. And that now for the insurance purposes, they will be figuring out what that first floor height is in all the zones. Oh, and as I mentioned, if any of those items doesn't apply, don't leave them blank. Don't put a 0, put an NA for not applicable. And there's many places where you need to put comments in section D. So it's pretty rare that you don't have comments in section D. And speaking of section D, that is where we basically should have the surveyor, that licensed surveyor or the professional engineer who's qualified in this area, signing, and when it's applicable, putting the seal. Not all states require the seal, so put whatever's required in your state where you're completing that elevation certificate. And again, many of the clarifying points for section C are going to be in this section D. If you don't have enough space here, you can say see attached and put additional details. And for E, we're going back to you, Gary, right?
Yeah, so for section E, this is the building measurements where a survey is not required. And I already kind of touched on this. In Minnesota, it's used in areas where there are no established baseline elevations. But again, for Minnesota, we're really only looking at those AO zones. I guess I can't reiterate that enough. It has to be those AO zones.
Because in Minnesota, we require you to calculate the elevations if a building's being constructed.
Exactly. So, but in this particular case, if you've got a building in an AO zone, no survey is required. So you can use hand tools, a tape measure or a ruler to take the measurements. In this particular case, it's going to be mostly, everything's going to be relative. You're taking measurements of the floor relative to the highest adjacent grade or the lowest adjacent grade. So you can see for E1, that's the top of the bottom floor. Am I above or below the highest adjacent grade by how many feet? Similar for the next higher floor under section E2, the next higher floor, how many feet am I above or below the highest adjacent grade? So it's just taking those relative measurements. Measurements must be relative to natural grade. I think we define that on the next slide, but they added a checkbox for building measurements are based on whether it's a construction drawing, under construction, or finished construction. And that's really just to provide some consistency with section C. Let's go to the next slide and see what we've got there. You must complete section E if you are in a zone AO, like I mentioned. And this is for the sole purpose of documenting compliance with the local floodplain management requirements. Section E really is for floodplain management purposes. However, if you are completing an elevation certificate in support of a letter of map change, you must complete section C instead of section E. Section C, as you might recall, and Ceil just talked about that, that's where you're going to have a surveyor out there to measure those floors. The measurements must be based on natural grade, which means the undisturbed natural surface of the ground prior to any excavation or fill. Section E3, we talked about this. You're entering heights of the floor relative to the highest adjacent grade. For E3, they're looking specifically at the attached garage slab. So you would be measuring the top of that slab relative to the highest adjacent grade. And lastly, E4 is where you're looking at your machinery and equipment, your air conditioner and things like that, both inside and outside machinery and equipment. And you're going to be measuring those relative to the highest adjacent grade. Moving on to section F. Section F is only going to be completed by the landowner, or the homeowner, I should say, if they completed Section E. So this is where they're going to sign and certify the elevations that they provided in Section E. If the local unit of government completed Section E, instead of signing and certifying Section F, they are going to sign Section G. I know Ceil mentioned this before. FEMA did add an email address field, and as with most of the sections, there's a comment box to provide any additional descriptions if they are necessary. Yeah, updated instructions. We talked about some of this already, but if Section E was completed by the property owner or their authorized representative in a Zone AO, if so, the community should confirm the heights to ensure compliance with their ordinance. If Section E was completed by the local floodplain manager, like I've said, they should complete Section G instead of Section F.
Okay, Section G's community information. Basically, it's very strongly recommended that the local official complete this part. And it's got a couple parts that have been added here and clarified, that the noting if the local official completed Section H, since that's a new section, there's a new place to indicate that's what happened. Or it had been that the community official was able to use Section G if they were basically transferring information from some other elevation document, and they can note that here with the G1. And they've got expansion trying to help local officials get some of the key information from a regulatory standpoint on this form to make it more useful for enforcing your regulations. So they've got places to make sure that you're indicating what is the lowest as-built, the elevation of the as-built lowest floor, and does that meet your ordinance? What is the base flood elevation? What is your local minimum elevation? In Minnesota, the regulatory flood protection elevation, either the state minimum or what's in your ordinance. Oh, and it gets into a little bit bigger version of this here. So the G2, it does get split to look at, again, whether the local official completed Section H or if they completed Section E, and noting that. And some of these other things are mainly to help you keep track of things if you want to use these forms in your community. And a reminder again that our CRS communities are required to use the elevation certificate and do have the FEMA consultants that review your elevation certificates every year. And here in G9, where it's asking the lowest floor and the lowest horizontal structure member, if that's applicable, that's been added, the elevation of the lowest horizontal structure member, and place to put the BFE, and again, linking what the BFE is versus the community's minimum elevation, or your RFPE. There's places to put that. The other interesting thing is that they are asking yes or no, was there a variance issued for this building? And if so, you're required to attach documentation of that variance. Oh, and yeah, here we've got a whole nother slide talking about that. So again, if there was a variance issued, you need to attach documentation as the local official, and then who's signing it and having your name and contact information there. So again, updated instructions, but a couple other things that have been added. The intent to add clarity on whether it's meeting your local ordinance or not, and making sure you've got the information in there to make that determination is what most of these things that got added have to do with. And going into Section H and I, we're going to hand it back to Garry. We are getting near the end, so we're going to go through a lot of this fairly quickly.
We're going to wrap this up with Section H and I. As Ceil mentioned, these are brand new sections. Section H is for the first floor height that Ceil had talked about. We're going to go into a whole lot more detail on the next slide. But yeah, surveys aren't required for Section H. Section I is only going to be completed if you actually do Section H. So yeah, let's dive into Section H. Please keep in mind, this is for insurance purposes only, and it can be completed by anybody. We already said there isn't a survey that's required. You're going to be using your measuring tape or ruler, taking hand measurements, and everything's going to be relative to the lowest adjacent grade. Can be used in all flood zones. When you look at the foundation diagrams in the elevation certificate instructions, you've got H1A, which is the top of the bottom floor above the lowest adjacent grade, and then H1B is that top of the next higher floor above the lowest adjacent grade. And then the H2 is going to be indicated on those foundation diagrams by an arrow. And you need to make sure that your machinery and equipment is at or above that elevation identified by the arrow. So we'll take a look at some of those foundation diagrams, I think in some of the next slides here. Floor by any other name. Now I know Ceil just went through this a moment ago. So just to recap, the bottom floor elevation, that is your C2A. It's going to be measured by your surveyor. That lowest floor elevation is really more for regulatory purposes. And that first floor height, as we're going to be talking about now in section H, is for insurance purposes. And it does apply to only the at or above grade structures. FEMA, I don't know if these are actually 3 simple rules, but FEMA says there are 3 simple rules for section H. Number 1, never measure a floor below ground level for section H. We're going to be looking at or above grade structures. H1A is that at or above or floor. And for buildings with basements and below grade crawl spaces, you're going to be using that H1B. So I don't know if that helps, but it kind of did for me. Measuring the first floor height. Again, everything's going to be relative to the lowest adjacent grade touching the structure. Instead of surveying, like in the photograph on the right, you're going to get your measuring tape out or yardstick. You don't need any specialized equipment. In the photograph on the right, that's probably a slab on grade structure. So how high off the ground is the first floor? In this particular case, your H1A is probably about, 7 inches maybe? I don't know that we need to spend a whole lot of time on this. We talked about the H1A as the top of the bottom floor above the lowest adjacent grade, and that applies to non-elevated buildings, and in the parentheses, it lists the appropriate building diagram numbers that are associated with that. It's also those buildings elevated on posts, piles, or piers with or without an enclosure, buildings elevated on solid foundation walls, that's building diagram 7. Those buildings elevated on a crawl space. We've looked at a few of those already. That's building diagram 8. Just remember, for H1A, it's only those above grade floors. H1B, as we already talked about, is the top of the next higher floor. Really applicable in most instances where you've got a basement, crawl space, or an enclosure. Yeah, H2, that's probably the most important part. So you want to make sure your machinery and equipment is located at or above the H2 arrow, and that's actually what they say. You look for the arrow to see where it needs to be elevated to, and it's going to depend on the foundation type diagram. I think Ceil already showed you some of those. You're going to select the appropriate foundation diagram based on your corresponding building diagram. So in these examples, you've got a slab on grade, non-elevated. So your H1A, your top of your bottom floor, is really just above that slab. So in this particular case, they say your H2, your machinery and equipment, has to be in the attic for that type of a building.
To get credit for the discount.
Yes, for the credit. The example below where the building elevated on posts or piles that doesn't have that enclosure, your H1A, again, is the top of that main elevated floor. And in this particular case, the H2 arrow is pointing to that same level. It's the main elevated floor. For machinery and equipment, I think what we want to try to drive home here is it includes machinery and equipment that's both inside or outside the building. The elevation certificate instructions do list a number of different types of machinery and equipment, such as listed here: central air conditioner, furnace, heat pump. But that list, just be aware that list is not all inclusive. And for contents coverage, it's the clothes washer, freezer, those types of things. So I already talked about those foundation type diagrams. They are in the elevation certificate instructions, and they are based on the corresponding building diagram. In this example, it's building diagram 5. It's a building elevated on posts or pilings. Per the foundation diagram, it shows where that H2 is going to be. H2 is where your machinery and equipment needs to be elevated. And this appears to be properly elevated. It's that first floor.
These elevated mobile homes are what we're more likely to see in Minnesota versus this coastal look.
Yeah, but the house on the right, that looks like we've got some problems. That's building diagram 8. That's a building elevated on a crawl space. You can see by the foundation diagram, the H1A is the top of the crawl space floor. Your H1B is your next higher floor, which is really where your main entryway is, your main floor. That's where the machinery and equipment needs to be elevated. And you can see they're off by, 1.5 feet there. And now, Ceil, they're going to go through each foundation diagram.
Yeah, and we're at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to kind of skim through. These will be in our slides, but the bottom line is that you're trying to figure out what's H1A versus B, and then where that equipment is for H2, and whether you can say yes or no on that part of the form. So yeah, we did try to cram too much in here. And I is, again, that you're documenting who completed section H. And this is a new form, new section, because it goes with the new section H. So again, you've got place for comments here. Oh, just which sections are, who can do what sections? A and B and E and F and H and I, anyone can fill in. Again, only that licensed professional can do sections C and D. Local officials, the only one who should be doing section G. And this kind of goes through and says, well, for floodplain management, these are what you should have. Yeah, you need to know what those elevations were to document they built properly. For insurance purposes, they can look at either section CD or HI to get those critical elevations they need. And for letter of map changes, they are going to be looking at CD. They're not going to be looking at what someone measured with their tape measure out there for a letter of map change. Ending with some of our summaries here. So thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody.